They call it the Alcatraz of the Rockies. Hidden deep in the Colorado wilderness, surrounded by layers of barbed wire, motion sensors and gun towers, stands a place so cold, so silent, that even time seems to stop at its gates. It's the end of the line for America's most dangerous men, terrorists, assassins, cartel kings and killers whose names have shaken the nation. Welcome to ADX Florence. Before we step through its steel doors, make sure you hit like and subscribe, because what you're about to hear is a journey into a world few have ever seen, and even fewer have survived. The story of ADX Florence begins in 1994, not as a dream but as a warning. The U.S. government had already witnessed chaos erupt inside its prison walls. Riots at Marion, killings in Atlanta, and escapes from facilities once thought unbreakable. The message was clear. America needed a place where control could never slip away again. So, in the barren desert south of Denver, engineers, security experts and psychologists came together to design something entirely new. A facility not just to hold men but to break them. Every inch of ADX Florence was built with precision and paranoia. Its concrete walls are reinforced with steel. Every door, window and corridor is a checkpoint. Even the air seems monitored, filtered through vents too narrow to see through. From above, the prison looks like a geometric nightmare. Layers of fences, coils of razor wire, and long corridors that stretch like veins across a slab of gray rock. Each cell, no larger than a parking space, is a world of isolation. Inside there's a concrete bed, a small desk, a toilet sink unit made of steel, and a slot through which food slides in silence. There are no bars, only solid walls and a single narrow slit of a window angled toward the sky, offering no glimpse of the mountains that surround it. Inmates here live 23 hours a day in solitude. Their meals are passed through the door. Their exercise takes place in what prisoners call the empty swimming pool, a small concrete pen open to the air but still surrounded by towering walls. Conversation between cells is nearly impossible. The silence is absolute. For most men, that silence is worse than any chain. Over the years, ADX Florence has held some of the most infamous names in modern history. The Unabomber, Ted Kaczynski, who mailed bombs across the nation. Ramzi Youssef, the mastermind behind the 1993 World Trade Center bombing. Richard Reed, the shoe bomber. And Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, the ruthless Sinaloa cartel boss who once tunneled out of a Mexican prison but found no escape from this one. Each of them was sent here for the same reason, not just for what they did but for what they could still do if left among others. ADX is where the system sends its incorrigibles, those too violent, too influential, or too unrepentant to exist anywhere else. Yet, behind the thick glass and the echoing corridors, a darker question lingers. What happens to a man when the world forgets he exists? What happens to the mind when every day feels exactly like the one before, and the only voices you hear are your own? Former wardens describe ADX as a clean version of hell. Human rights investigators call it torture by design. But for the guards, the architects, and the officials who defend it, ADX is a necessary evil, the ultimate answer to the chaos that once consumed America's prisons. When you walk through its gates, you walk into control perfected. But control has a price. And inside these walls, that price is sanity. As the years passed, even the staff began to sense it. The tension that hums in the air like static electricity, the knowledge that at any second, behind any door, a legend of violence might be staring back. The concrete may contain their bodies, but it cannot contain their past. Each inmate brings his own shadow, a trail of blood, betrayal, and infamy that seeps through the cracks of the system. And in a place built to erase individuality, their stories remain trapped like whispers in a tomb. This is not just a prison. It's a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of human nature, both theirs and ours. Long before the first inmate ever set foot inside ADX Florence, the concept itself became a quiet obsession within the highest levels of federal security. The early 1990s were a turbulent time in American corrections, a decade marked by ambushes, inmate uprisings, and prison gangs growing more powerful than the institutions meant to contain them. At facilities from Marion to Leavenworth, violence had reached a boiling point. Wardens were attacked. Guards were killed. Entire units fell under the influence of gang shot callers who ran criminal empires from behind bars. The government needed something beyond bars and fences, something absolute. In Washington, officials proposed a new classification, the administrative maximum, a facility that would embody a simple philosophy, not rehabilitation, not restraint, but total control. Every movement would be calculated. Every action predicted. Every risk eliminated through design, routine, and surveillance so comprehensive it bordered on science fiction. It wouldn't just be a prison. It would be a machine. Architects studied blueprints used for high-security research labs and military command centers. Psychologists outlined how long-term sensory reduction could influence behavior. Engineers proposed new types of steel-reinforced concrete that could withstand explosions, tunneling attempts, and decades of stress. Even the windows, only 4 inches tall and angled upward, were designed so no inmate could see another human being, or even remember what a horizon looked like. But the goal wasn't to torture. At least that's what the officials insisted. The goal was to eliminate unpredictability. Inside most prisons, danger comes from movement, prisoners entering yards, crossing hallways, gathering in chow lines, forming alliances, exchanging looks, passing notes. ADX Florence removed all of that. Here there would be no cafeterias, no communal yards, no open tiers echoing with voices. Every door would be electronic, controlled by officers behind shatterproof glass. Every meal would arrive through a slot. Every shower would occur alone in a separate stall under watch. The design was cold, efficient, clinical. A place where a man could remain physically alive while being completely separated from the world. Security experts marveled at the complexity. Human rights groups were horrified. But construction continued, mile by mile, brick by brick, over a lonely stretch of land near Florence, Colorado, a small town that never expected to become home to one of the most feared institutions on Earth. When the facility finally opened in 1994, the staff took their first walk through its sterile corridors. The walls seemed to swallow sound. The lights hummed faintly but unchanging, like a heartbeat without pause. There was no smell of sweat, no echo of voices, no clatter of bars slamming shut. Instead, there was an overwhelming stillness, a kind of engineered silence that felt unnatural to anyone who had worked in prisons before. Officers reported that on some days, you could stand in a hallway and hear nothing but your own breathing. ADX Florence had no need for warnings painted on the floor, no signs reminding inmates to obey. Obedience was built into the architecture. And here, resistance was pointless. Violence was impossible. Escape was a fantasy. And yet, for all its precision, there was an unintended side effect: the psychological atmosphere that clung to the place like a shadow. Staff members later said that even before the first inmates arrived, they felt it. A heaviness in the air. A sense that something about this prison wasn't simply secure, it was alive in its own way, humming with potential energy waiting to be filled. Then came the transfers, the first wave of men who had left bloodshed in their wake at other prisons. The Aryan Brotherhood shot callers from Marion. The cartel's most fearsome killers. Domestic terrorists. Political extremists. Men who had ordered murders with a whisper. Men who refused to kneel to any authority. They came shackled, surrounded by guards, flown in by armored transport and escorted through the reinforced gates one by one. For the first time the machine had its fuel. And as they stepped into the sterile halls of ADX, even the most hardened among them paused. The silence stunned them. The isolation pressed against them like invisible hands. A few tried to act defiant. Most didn't say a word. Many of them had spent years in tough prisons, but nothing prepared them for a place designed to erase the concept of freedom altogether. Some later admitted that the moment the door closed behind them, a realization hit. This is where the world ends. And this was only the beginning. When word spread through the federal system that ADX Florence had finally opened its gates, something strange happened inside prisons across the country. The toughest inmates, men who had survived riots, gang wars, lockdowns, and decades of violence, began to speak the name Florence in a different tone. Not with fear exactly, but with a kind of quiet recognition. A place like this didn't need threats or legends. Its reputation was born from design alone. Soon the transfers began in waves. Prison officials selected the highest-risk individuals, the ones labeled administrative headaches or security nightmares, and prepared them for a one-way trip to the most fortified structure the Bureau of Prisons had ever created. Some inmates left their previous facilities surrounded by armored convoys. Others were flown in on federal marshals' aircraft, their wrists and ankles locked in black steel restraints. And all of them arrived believing they already knew the worst prison conditions imaginable. They didn't. The first group included men like Thomas Silverstein, the Aryan Brotherhood enforcer who had spent decades in isolation after killing a correctional officer at USP Marion. Silverstein had been called America's most isolated prisoner long before ADX existed, yet even he entered Florence with a sense of disbelief. For men who had spent lifetimes in concrete boxes, experiencing a new kind of confinement was almost unimaginable, but that was exactly what ADX delivered. Here every sound was swallowed. Even your own footsteps seemed muted, absorbed by the thick concrete surrounding you. Doors didn't slam, they hissed. Chains didn't rattle, they clicked. The walls didn't echo, they watched. It was a silence so complete that men who had spent years sharpening their instincts in chaotic prison environments found themselves disoriented, as if reality itself had been muffled. Then came the second wave, the terrorists. Ramzi Youssef, the architect of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, was escorted in under tight security, his arrival marking a shift in who ADX was meant to contain. He was followed by men like Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber, and later by others whose crimes had reshaped national security itself. These inmates weren't violent gang members. They were ideological, clever, driven by causes that reached far beyond the prison walls. At ADX, ideology meant nothing. The silence smothered belief as effectively as it smothered rage. And then, inevitably, came the cartel lords, dangerous not only for their violence but for their influence. Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, whose escape tunnels in Mexico became legendary, arrived years later under the watch of snipers, air support, armored vehicles, and a convoy so heavily guarded that Florence locals still talk about the day it moved through town. For a man who once walked out of prisons through underground passages carved with engineering precision, ADX represented something new, a cage without a single angle to exploit. But some arrivals were quieter. Some belonged to men the public had forgotten, but whom the government never could. Serial killers, espionage agents, white supremacist leaders who controlled armies from behind bars. Brilliant but broken loners whose crimes had terrified the nation. Each inmate entered through the same steel gateway, passed under the same watchful eyes, and felt the same sensation, a coldness that didn't come from temperature, but from the awareness that life as they knew it had ended. The orientation process was brief, mechanical. Officers explained rules not with intimidation, but with the calm certainty of a system that allowed no exceptions. Inmates learned that communication with others was almost non-existent. They learned that reading materials, exercise, and even sunlight were privileges earned through behavior. They learned that every action, every gesture, every conversation, every attempt at defiance, was monitored, recorded, and analyzed. Most terrifying of all, they learned that talking to another human being was no longer a guarantee. Days could pass without hearing a voice, weeks without seeing another inmate, months without touching another living soul. For some, this isolation brought peace, a strange emptiness that softened the edges of memory. For others, it sharpened everything, guilt, anger, regret, until their own thoughts cut into them like blades. Staff noticed the changes early on. Men who entered defiant grew quiet. Men who arrived with rage became detached. Letters became shorter. Eye contact faded. In the control rooms, officers sometimes leaned forward and squinted at monitors just to confirm an inmate was still moving. ADX didn't just confine the body, it reshaped the mind. And as the cells filled with the country's most dangerous criminals, the rest of the world went on, unaware of what the silence inside ADX was doing to the men locked within it. The facility, designed to eliminate unpredictability, began shaping a new kind of unpredictability, the psychological collapse that can only come from absolute isolation. Inside these walls, time lost its meaning. Memories grew louder than voices. And the men sent here, men the world feared for their power, became shadows trapped in concrete. The prison had achieved its purpose. But at a cost no one could measure. For most prisons, daily life is dictated by noise, doors slamming, guards shouting, inmates arguing, metal clanking, radios buzzing. But at ADX Florence the rhythm is different. It's quieter, more controlled. It's a routine so rigid and predictable that it stops feeling like a schedule and starts feeling like a slow erosion of identity. The day begins not with voices or footsteps, but with the soft metallic slide of a food slot opening. Breakfast arrives around the same time every morning, delivered on a tray passed through a rectangular gap in the door. The inmate might hear the faint echo of carts rolling down the tier, but nothing more. No guard face. No greeting. Just a momentary movement, then silence again. Inside the 7 by 12 foot cell, time moves in a straight line. The concrete bed is built into the wall, topped with a thin mattress that never truly softens. A steel combination toilet sink unit sits in the corner. A tiny concrete desk and seat, molded from the same wall, offer a surface for writing, though many men never use it. A television is permitted in later phases of behavior programs, but for those in the most restrictive units, there is only emptiness. The most distinctive feature is the window. A long, thin slit, too narrow to see anything but a fragment of sky. Not a tree. Not a building. Not another human being. Just a strip of pale blue or gray that changes with the weather. Many prisoners say the lack of a horizon is what disturbs the mind the most. Without distance, without visual landmarks, the brain begins to lose track of place and scale. Days blur. Reality becomes a loop. Around mid-morning, inmates are allowed their single hour of exercise, but again alone. They are escorted, in restraints, to an outdoor recreation area that resembles an empty concrete box. Some call it the kennel. Others call it the cage. From inside, a prisoner can look up and see the sky but nothing else. The world remains hidden behind high walls and layers of razor wire. Some do push-ups. Some pace in circles. Some stare upward, searching for a bird, a cloud, anything moving. When the hour ends, guards return silently and escort them back. The doors close with a sound that's less dramatic than people imagine. A soft, final click that somehow feels more permanent than a slam. Lunch arrives the same way breakfast did, through the slot, without a word. There are no group programs. No cafeteria. No communal chapel. No library visits. Every activity happens in isolation or through concrete barriers. Even medical checkups often involve a barrier between patient and staff. Mental health interviews can be conducted through thick glass or intercoms, creating conversations that are more like echoes than dialogue. Guards patrol the tiers, but they rarely speak unless necessary. Their posture reflects something the inmates quickly learn. At ADX, interaction is not a part of the job, containment is. By afternoon, the silence deepens. Many inmates have described it as a tightness in the air, a pressure around the ears, something that makes them feel as though the building itself is listening. Thoughts begin to repeat. Some men talk to themselves simply to hear a voice. Others try to sleep, though sleep comes in strange patterns here, short, restless bursts rather than long stretches. Letters become essential for survival. For some, writing is the only form of self-expression left. But even letters are monitored, inspected, and delayed. Communication with the outside world is limited, controlled, and never guaranteed. Dinner arrives early, a tray through the slot. After that, the hours stretch out like an endless hallway. Men read if they have books. They think about their past if they can bear it. They replay memories of faces they may never see again. The design of ADX ensures there is nothing to distract from the weight of those memories. No chatter from other inmates. No arguments. No sudden noises. Just the hum of air vents and the distant buzz of fluorescent lights. Some prisoners describe a gradual feeling of drifting, not physically but mentally, as though their thoughts float in the air and never fully return. Psychologists call it sensory deprivation syndrome. Inmates call it the slow fade. The night brings no difference. The lights dim but never fully go out. Safety requires visibility. So the cell stays illuminated enough to erase any illusion of darkness or privacy. Even dreaming becomes difficult when the brain has no contrast between day and night, activity and stillness, stimulation and silence. And yet, this routine repeats with machine-like precision, day after day, year after year. Some inmates adapt. Some endure. Some unravel. The Bureau of Prisons argues that ADX exists because the men within it shattered lives, disrupted nations, or brought chaos wherever they went. The world needed a place where their influence stopped, where their violence ended. But inside these walls, the question grows louder with every silent day. How much of a man can you lock away before something essential begins to die? The routine doesn't just contain the worst offenders in America. It transforms them. And it's inside this transformation, this razor-thin line between security and psychological collapse, that the story of ADX Florence becomes darker than anyone outside its gates truly understands. Long before psychologists began publishing reports about ADX Florence, the men living inside its concrete walls understood something instinctively. Isolation doesn't hit all at once. It creeps. It coils itself quietly around the mind, tightening a little more each day until the line between thought and hallucination becomes thin as dust. This slow unraveling became known among inmates and former staff as the shadow effect. The point where silence becomes a second prisoner, following a man everywhere he goes, even inside his dreams. It begins with small changes. A prisoner starts pacing more often, tracing the same path along the floor until the concrete darkens. Another grows fixated on the slit of sky outside his window, memorizing the way light shifts hour by hour. Some begin talking aloud, at first deliberately just to hear something human. Then the talking becomes automatic. Then frantic. Sometimes angry. Sometimes soft, like whispering to someone who isn't there. Corrections officers have described hearing muffled arguments coming from empty cells, Prisoners shouting at voices only they can hear, responding to insults or commands that live entirely inside their minds. For a few men, the shadow arrives not as madness but as something emptier, a numbness that spreads through every part of their lives. Food loses its taste. Time loses its shape. Sleep becomes broken, restless, filled with vivid dreams that disappear as quickly as they form. These inmates stop writing letters. They stop asking for anything. They sit on the edge of their concrete bed for hours, unmoving, staring at nothing. One former guard described it like this. Some men walk in full of fire, full of ego, full of fight. 6 months later they don't even look up when you pass their cell. It's like the prison is slowly erasing them. Psychiatrists who have studied long-term solitary confinement say the brain is built for interaction. Without exposure to other voices, expressions, or physical environments, neural pathways begin to wither. Thought patterns become circular. Anxiety spikes. Paranoia blooms. The ability to regulate emotion weakens. In extreme cases, the mind begins to fracture. And ADX Florence, by design, removes every natural stimulus that keeps a person grounded. No conversations. No physical contact. No environmental variety. No human faces except for brief moments, viewed through glass or mesh. The result is a kind of psychological pressure cooker. Silent, invisible, relentless. Some inmates try to fight the shadow effect by creating routines of their own. They write intense, detailed journals. They memorize entire books. They exercise obsessively, doing hundreds of push-ups or sit-ups just to feel movement, to remind themselves they are still alive. They pace until their muscles shake. Others turn inward, losing themselves in memories. They replay moments from childhood, from the streets, from past crimes. The past becomes sharper than the present. Destroyed relationships resurface. Guilt becomes a companion. So does defiance. So does regret. But there are men for whom the past is too dark to revisit. Men who committed acts so violent, so cold-blooded, that remembering them becomes its own kind of torment. For them, isolation doesn't break the mind as much as it forces them to confront pieces of themselves they tried to outrun. And yet, there are also those who resist the shadow entirely. Men whose minds remain eerily intact despite years, even decades, in near-complete solitude. These inmates often possess an internal discipline forged long before they ever entered ADX. Some come from extremist groups or intelligence backgrounds. Some are leaders used to operating alone. Some, disturbingly, seem almost comfortable with the quiet. Staff say these are the inmates who watch everything. Who learn the officers' schedules with uncanny precision. Who calculate every detail of their environment, even when there's nothing to calculate. For these men, ADX becomes not a punishment, but a new battlefield, one fought with patience instead of violence. But even for them, the prison's atmosphere leaves marks. Their eyes grow distant. Their posture changes. Their voices flatten. Their emotions become measured and rare, as though they've been packed away behind the same steel and concrete that surrounds them. And then there are the moments when the shadow manifests physically, sudden outbursts, self-harm attempts, or episodes of rage that erupt out of nowhere. A man might scream for hours, pounding on the door, begging for a voice to answer him. Another might shut down entirely, refusing meals, refusing movement, refusing even to speak. Some rock back and forth. Some tear apart their bedding. Some create elaborate fantasies to replace reality. The most haunting stories come from the men who once led gangs, cartels, terrorist cells. Men who commanded armies with a word, now sitting alone in a room so quiet they can hear their own heartbeat. ADX was built to control the uncontrollable. But the human mind is its own universe, and even concrete cannot contain every shadow inside it. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that ADX is necessary, that the men housed within its walls pose dangers too great for any other environment. And perhaps that's true. Perhaps there are crimes so severe and men so violent, that only a place like this can hold them. But deep inside these cold, hollow corridors lies a truth the outside world rarely sees. Even in the most secure prison in America, the greatest threat isn't escape. It's what isolation does to the soul. And for some inmates, the shadow effect is only the beginning. ADX Florence was never meant to be a temporary stop. For some inmates, it is the end of the line, the final destination in a life shaped by violence, terror, or power gone wrong. But inside these walls, life sentence takes on a different meaning. Not years. Not decades. A lifetime of silence. Some men arrive knowing they will die here. Others realize it slowly as appeals fade and the outside world forgets their names. A few still cling to hope, a program transfer, a step-down unit, a chance to rejoin the general prison population. But for most, ADX becomes a closed circle from which there is no exit. These are the men who learn to live with the void. One inmate, known for orchestrating attacks from behind bars, entered the prison with cold confidence. He had survived stabbings, wars between prison gangs, and a life defined by dominance. But ADX was different. There were no soldiers here. No followers to command. His power evaporated in the silence. Years later, officers reported he barely spoke at all. Another prisoner, once a high-ranking cartel lieutenant, had been feared across multiple countries. His enemies stretched from border towns to entire governments. Yet inside ADX he became just another number behind another steel door. His influence meant nothing. The empire he built continued without him, and he watched from a cell no larger than the closet he once used to hide weapons. Even the ideological warriors, men who believed their actions were part of a greater mission, found themselves swallowed by the stillness. Extremist leaders who once gave fiery speeches now whispered prayers into the concrete, their words vanishing into the air like dust. For the most notorious inmates, the endless routine becomes a kind of mirror. The crimes they committed, the people they harmed, the chaos they unleashed, all of it returns in the silence. Some confront it, some deny it, some break under it, and then there are the suicides. Despite its design, despite constant monitoring, ADX has witnessed its share of men who simply could not endure the isolation. Some meticulously planned their deaths. Others acted impulsively, driven by a desperation that built up day after day with nowhere to go. Each loss sent ripples through the staff, reminders that even a fortress can't fully contain the collapse of the human mind. The prison administration created step-down programs intended to help inmates transition to lower security facilities over time. These programs reward good behavior with small privileges. A radio-limited conversation, maybe even the hope of leaving ADX one day. But the requirements are strict. The progress is slow. Some inmates never reach the threshold. And a few, especially those labeled permanent threats, aren't even eligible. So they stay. Watching the seasons change through a window too narrow to show a landscape. Growing older without ever shaking another person's hand. Counting the years by the fading of their own memories. ADX Florence houses men responsible for unthinkable acts. Men who destroyed lives, toppled buildings, terrorized nations. Some believe the isolation is justice. Others believe it's cruelty. But inside these walls, moral debates don't matter. The system has already decided their fate. Here, punishment isn't just time. It is silence. Endless, absolute, merciless silence. And even the strongest minds eventually bend beneath its weight. As officers walk the corridors at night, peering through small windows into small worlds, they sometimes see the quiet truth of the place. Men sitting alone in cells with no sound, no movement, no trace of who they once were. It is in these moments that ADX Florence reveals its real power. It does not dominate the body. It dismantles the spirit. For some inmates, that transformation is the final chapter. For others, it marks the slow descent toward something even darker. But for all of them, one truth never changes. No matter who they were on the outside. No matter how feared they were in the world. Inside ADX Florence, everyone becomes the same. A shadow in a cell. A voice with no echo. A life reduced to silence. ADX Florence remains one of the most controversial institutions on Earth. A fortress of concrete and steel built to contain the men America fears most, yet haunted by the psychological toll it inflicts. Supporters call it essential. Critics call it inhumane. But no matter which side you stand on, one thing is clear. This place exposes the limits of human endurance in ways few can imagine. Behind every locked door is a story. Behind every silence is a consequence. And behind every inmate is a past the world will never forget. If you found this deep dive into the Alcatraz of the Rockies gripping, hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications. There are more hidden stories, darker truths, and untold histories waiting in the shadows of the world's most dangerous prisons. Until next time, stay curious, stay aware. And remember, some walls aren't built to keep people in. They're built to keep the rest of the world safe.